Hello and welcome to another episode of the Argus Fertilizer Matters podcast. My name's Mike Nash and I'm the Senior Fertilizer Editor based here in London. And today on the show, I'm delighted to welcome back Claudia Wlk, our Fertilizer Europe Editor. Claudia has been with Argus since 2017, originally working in the oil products market before making the transition to the fertilizer team, working first on the phosphates market and then on our Africa publication before becoming Fertilizer Europe editor in July of 2022. Claudia, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Mike. It's a pleasure to be back.
Great to have you back. So today we are going to be discussing a key development in the European fertilizer industry, and that is the imposition of significant additional duties on imports of Russian fertilizers into the EU, which will take effect on the 1st of July. So what we're going to be covering in this podcast is firstly, what is the EU going to do? Secondly, what is the significance of the timing? How significant is Russian fertilizer supply into the EU? What the impact might be in terms of prices, and lastly, where the EU might be able to source alternative supply. So over to you, Claudia. What exactly has the EU done?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that everything I'm going to say applies on top of the already existing 6.5% duty that already exists for all of the external markets that don't have any tariff exemptions. So what we're going to be seeing, starting in July this year, there will be additional tariffs imposed for fertilizers coming from Russia and Belarus. And these are going to ramp up over the next few years. So basically from July, what we're going to be seeing is 40 euros per ton extra on the import of nitrogen fertilizers, anything that's under that like 3102 tariff code. So that applies to urea, AMSIL, AN, CAN, UAN. And then we're going to have a 45 euro per ton import duty on top of the fertilizers that contain phosphates and the complex fertilizers. So that's DAP, MAP, NPKs, MP, and a few others. Notably, there won't be anything additional for MOP. And as I already mentioned, we're going to see this rate rise year on year. So those 45 euros are going to rise every year until from 2028, they reach a level of over 300 euros for the nitrogen side and over 400 euros for the phosphate and NPK side. Now, aside from those figures, which are obviously quite significant, we are also going to be seeing, starting in July this year, a threshold for imports. And to me, this is almost more important than the actual tariffs, at least for the first year. So Russian and Belarusian imports are going to be not capped, but they're going to have a threshold at 2.7 million tons cumulatively for the 2025-26 fertilizer year. And if the imports reach this threshold, then the tariffs are going to jump from those 45 euros up to the highest level designated from 2028. So once we reach the 2.7 million tons, duties jump to 315 euros per ton for nitrogen and to 430 euros per ton for the phosphates and NPK side. To put that into context, in 2024, the EU imported over 4.3 million tons of these impacted fertilizers from Russia alone. So this 2.7 million ton threshold would remove a third of imports we saw in 2024. And then over the next few years, this threshold will get smaller and smaller until the duties are just at those highest levels from 2028.
So thanks for that explanation, Claudia. And the plain fact is that the EU is heavily reliant on Russian fertilizer imports. So just to take a few examples, on urea, in 2024, GTT data showed that Russia supplied around 16% of all urea imports last year. That's about 1.7 million tons. That's into the EU 27 out of a total 11 million tons. That makes it the second largest supplier after Egypt. And for DAP, it's a fifth of the 2 million tons that were imported into the EU 27 last year. That's around just over 400,000 tons. That makes it the second largest supplier behind OCP Morocco. And for NPKs, potentially most significant, it's 20% of 5.3 million tons imported last year, which makes it the single largest supplier with over 1 million tons. And it does also supply MPS, MAP and UAN. I think on a more general point, Europe is something of a bubble. This is something I've said for a long time, from a logistical perspective. So it's heavily reliant on fertilizer imports from two main regions, that is Russia and North Africa, particularly for nitrogen and phosphate products. So it relies on smaller coastal vessels and freight logistics to limit supply to those producers that are fairly close geographically. So it's not straightforward to simply import necessarily from alternative sources. So back to you, Claudia. What impacts do you expect to see short term in terms of, firstly, in terms of prices?
Well, it's important to state that legally it's always the importer that pays the tariffs. But of course, then it's a question of whether producers from Russia will just accept the lower netbacks or the importers have to pay up. So that always will depend on the market dynamics, on the kind of global demand supply situation, and of course also the demand supply situation in Europe. And generally, I think what we're going to be seeing is a shift in trade flows globally. So some of the scenarios that we're going to be seeing is these duties could be passed on to the end user so that there will be a premium for fertilizers from Russia, or maybe in general for fertilizers in Europe. Then on the other hand, if the market allows for it and Russian producers have nowhere else to really send their product, they could take a hit on those netbacks. We will very likely also see a pivot of Russian product to other markets, particularly its domestic and regional markets. And also there might just be demand destruction if prices rise as much as the tariffs could suggest. So that would mean that importers would simply import less and farmers would consume less, and there would be maybe a switch to some other products. But it will be highly individual to the individual grade and product that we're talking about. Very likely also other producers will take advantage, will fill the gap if there is just no Russian product coming in, but that would probably be at elevated prices because of the tight supply.
Thank you for that, Claudia. I think it's important as well to note that these duties, if you're adding 40 to 45 euros a ton to some of the key import products, you're looking at a 7 to 10% price hike almost overnight of Russian material, just looking at it notionally, but given current sort of FCA prices in Europe, depending on the product. I guess the next question is to what extent, if necessary, could the EU replace these volumes from other sources? So Claudia, let's take urea first. Where do you see urea going?
That's a really good question on the kind of shifting trade flows. So on urea, we do think there is enough globally and from lower or similar cost exporters that could replace those like 1.6 to 1.7 million tons that you mentioned earlier. The most obvious examples for suppliers that could fill the gaps are Algeria and Egypt. You will probably see is Russian urea go to other markets, pushing out suppliers to those markets normally and altering the trade flows as a result. So there is a lot of Russian new capacity coming online as well, and the global market will be well supplied.
Thanks, Claudia. Yeah, and just quickly looking at phosphates and NPKs, phosphates doesn't really grow that much. Europe is a mature market in a lot of fertilizer products. It's not a large MAP market, never has been, certainly Western Europe. Eastern Europe's a bit of a different story. But DAP from Russia was less than 500,000 tons last year. And I think you could easily see producers in North Africa, particularly OCP, quite easily fill that gap. It's not even a month's production for them. And producers could pivot towards Europe. They may ignore or have less exposure to other markets because Europe is the premium market traditionally. For me, the interesting one is NPKs, where Russia is that single largest supplier at over 1 million tons. So that's followed by Norway, Finland, obviously the Yara facilities, which has another 25% of all supply. And then you've got Belgium with 12% of supply. The question is, will it lead to more indigenous production and greater capacity utilization within the EU? There's a lot of unused capacity within the EU. That's possible. Or will it lead to a move towards sort of smaller, more flexible production facilities serving local markets? That's also possible, but the issue there becomes one of raw material supply and also the environmental impact of additional capacity and production. Or simply, will there be demand destruction and Europe overall potentially shrinks somewhat as an NPK consumer and it switches to other products? And again, we must stress the caveat here remains Europe's logistical position and that reliance on smaller vessels to many of its ports. Claudia, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Lots to digest here, and obviously Argus will keep everybody abreast of market developments as they happen. That brings us to the end of this Argus Fertilizer Matters podcast. My sincere thanks to Claudia Wlk, Fertilizer Europe editor here at Argus.
Thanks very much for having me, Mike.
Been a pleasure. Thank you. And as always, thanks for listening. And don't forget to look out for the next episode, which we will record in a couple of weeks. Until then, this is Mike Nash for Argus Media. Bye for now.